Good morning, board and management. My name is Steve Schaap. I live in Tualatin, Oregon, and I'm here as a individual activist. Before I get to my points, I recognize in the comments there was mention of the Beaver heat treating plant that has to be moved. That's going to cost upwards of $23 million for the one business. I can only assume that Trimet in its wisdom would go ahead and fund that or try to pay for that if it was $50 million or $100 million, because there seems to be no obstacle that's too insurmountable for the board in considering continuing with this line. The other thing that was mentioned by Fred Hansen was the unfunded annual liability from other post-employment benefits of $50 million a year if they were funding it, and they're currently not funding any of it. So that's an enormous problem. There should be, you know, an agitating red flag for all you folks, and I don't recognize it as being observed that way. And Fred's moving on, and here we are, $50 million unfunded bill. Also, he mentioned that he didn't have the numbers for the ridership trends from last year to this year, minus the green line. That's simply not credible. And if he's going to report on ridership, obviously he should have had that on the tip of his tongue. You add a new line, you don't report what the ridership is, that's not credible. Now, getting to my testimony today, you know, I'm an expert at urban renewal and a lot of the dynamics involved in the Milwaukee Light Rail, and from South Waterfront to Clackamas County, and certainly very familiar with the concerns that the fire district and the sheriff had. But just today's paper, to give you an idea of the circumstances we're facing, here's an article out British, out in the British Isles, or Britain. British budget slices welfare, makes deepest cuts in decades. That has nothing to do with here, but it's starting to make a picture. There's another one here. Time to finalize the Selwood Bridge budget. Well, we know that's not fun. It's not going to happen for a good long time. That's a problem, though. It needs money. Capital project, desperately needed. On the front page, we got Oregon to slice budgets, 9%. Now, it's not like we're at the bottom of a trough and all things are going to turn rosy. So Mr. Lurbach's concerns earlier are spot on. Things could get much worse. Now, moving on to my documents, I gave you copies of my testimony there. First comes this notion of financing versus funding. And, you know, on the McLaughlin area urban renewal plan that Clackamas County is preparing, they hired Eco Northwest to produce a memorandum on potential funding for that plan. During that time, they made a distinction between funding and financing. And funding comes ultimately from households and businesses that pay taxes and fees that give the various levels of government money to build public improvements. When the funds for projects are borrowed and paid back over time, then these costs have been financed. And there's a big difference there. My contention is that Milwaukee Light Rail is not funded. It's financed. Even your own share is bonded money that you haven't created any new revenue for. In fact, you're relying on future operating revenue to retire those debts. And from top to bottom, it's the same thing. The current lottery fund, lottery bonds, is exactly the same thing. You know that the current lottery revenue stream is already dedicated or committed and flowing to budgets that are constraining. So we know that in the future down the road here, this coming year, the state distribution to the counties and the municipalities of the lottery money was going to diminish. What you're proposing here is moves forward with something that's going to further diminish the distribution of lottery funds. Not an increase in gambling or lottery revenue. And again, this is a financing tool, it's not funding. Moving on to...
Steve, just in the interest of time, if you can kind of keep it concise, because we got lots of other presenters.
I understand that, but that certainly has only been a couple minutes, so please.
Let's go on, but please.
Regarding the tax increment financing, the tax increment financing is simply borrowing against operating budgets, as you well know. That's not funding. And I can tell you from experience in a recent reversal by Tualatin City Council in Tualatin that the Clackamas County Urban Renewal Plan to fund Milwaukee Light Rail is not going to happen. I mean, I'm virtually assured of that. They're not going to get concurrence that the new legislation requires, and folks like myself are going to make it clear that how exactly that urban renewal works. And you all got a copy of this graph that explains how it actually works. And you cannot call urban renewal funding, it's financing. And moving on to the jobs losses. The jobs losses in the corridor there have been described as 600 lost jobs displaced and 60 businesses. And when the community speaks up to Metro, in a gathering, this is the community speaking, they were concerned about, well, what about the jobs? And of course there's the notion that maybe this line will create jobs. Well, this is how the Metro planner described the effort there. Regarding jobs, we're not saying the project is going to create all those jobs. We're saying there is the capacity for those jobs. The job growth that was discussed is not necessarily project specific, but is job and growth potential in general. However, with the project, there will be more access to jobs and growth. We try to use rigorous methodology and the best data we can get. We try to see longer term trends, but it's not exact science. Well, obviously that he says that our final economic conclusion is mixed. On one hand, there may be
Mr.
some...
Schaap, I'm sorry, we're running out of time. Wrap it up.
I'll wrap it up. The other factor is that not only is the project not funded, and you can't claim it is, because there's so much urban renewal, but the other thing, when you look at the plan going on here, it's a tremendous mission creep. It will add costs, not reduce them. So when you look at the plans associated with the transit station, the area, McLaughlin area plan, there's a whole litany of things that will cost more money that themselves are not funded either.
Thank you.
So please pay attention to the sheriff and the fire chief.
Thanks.
And discover the difference between funding and financing.
Appreciate your comments.